Hi, I'm Rebecca Connell here in the Cool Tools studio, and today I'm going to show you how to use pre-made bezel cups to add non-fireable stones to your metal clay pieces. For this project, I'm using EZ960 clay, rolling frames in 4 and 5 card thicknesses, a roller, the Cool Tools clay hydrator, cool slip, a tough card, the Eastern Elements texture, ultra clay pick, and a 6mm mandrel, and a cutting mat. So the first thing I'm going to do is roll my clay patty at a 5 card thickness. And I like to, if it's really soft, I like to just roll it around in my hands a little bit. I actually want to take a little bit of moisture out of this so that it doesn't sink into the texture too much and get stuck. And then I'm going to press down. Because I'm going to roll forward, I'm going to make it as wide as I think I need it for the texture, and then roll it. And then I get a kind of roundish shape that I know will cover this texture. And then I'm going to spray this down. It's the first time I'm using it, so the clay might stick in those really deep areas. Wipe off any excess with a paper towel, just because I want to use as little or introduce as little lubricant into the clay as possible. And then I'm using 2 extra texture tiles here that match the depth of this sheet. And that's because this design is on the corner, and I won't be able to roll it very easily without the support around it. Now I'm pick up my clay patty. I'm going to place it on my texture. I'm going down to 4 cards thickness because I want the texture not be super deep. So 5 down to 4, 1 card is plenty for this texture. And I'm going to start a little bit of ways on the tips of my finger. 1 pass really hard. Sometimes the roller goes flying. And I'm going to get these extra tools out of the way. I'm going to flip this over and just gently release it onto my hand. I'm being as careful as possible not to warp the shape too much. Okay? I'm going to put my 5 card frame back down, and I'm just going to equalize this texture a little bit. And this is going to keep an even depth all around the piece. I like to flip it over because occasionally these can get a little bit warped. I'm just gently pressing. I'm not pressing really hard. And now I'm going to take, this is a 6mm mandrel. I'm using a 5mm stone, and this 6mm mandrel will end up being, after the clay piece is fired, about the same size as the bezel cup and stone. And what I'm going to do is press very gently down on the very center of this piece, and that's so that that little bit of texture in the middle is flattened out and gives me more surface area for my bezel cup. Or more surface contact, I should say. And I'm trying not to disturb the texture outside of this center area. Okay, I'm happy with that. And now I will cut. I'm not too concerned about cutting perfectly here. We're going to come back and trim this once it's dry and then sand to refine it. EZ960 maintains some flexibility when it's dry, which makes it really easy to cut with an X-Acto knife. And I don't want to get too close to these corners because then I can distort and drag the clay around a bit. All right, I'll peel this up. Put the excess clay away. And then I'm just going to take a look and make sure everything looks okay. Looks good to me. And now I'm going to let this dry completely, either for a few hours in the open air or for about 20 minutes on a fairly low heat in a dehydrator. For this part of the project, I'll be using a round needle file, a tissue blade, a dust container, a superfine sanding sponge, a pin vise with a twist drill, a 4mm stone setting burr, and a carving knife. The first thing I'm going to do is trim the excess off with this carving knife as much as I can, just because it's faster than sanding, and I can also put these pieces that I'm cutting off, I can reclaim them back into fresh clay. And I'm just carefully going around a little bit at a time. Sometimes I like to do these cutting and turning movements. And I'll just continue around like this until I've trimmed off the bulk of the excess around this little outside border. And then I'll go in and further refine with the sanding sponge. Now I'm going to go ahead and sand these edges down all the way to the little border using the sanding sponge. I like these because they're rigid enough I can get into these corners. And I'm going to take it easy. You can go all the way around a little bit, then go all the way around again, so you don't overdo it anywhere, because they work fairly quickly. It's easy to take off too much. Now I'm going to sand the back once the edges are all cleaned up, and with a fresh sanding sponge, I find that it's a little hard to sand the back, just it sticks really hard. So it's a little too gritty. So I actually like to take it and kind of sand it against itself. And this will soften it a little bit. It'll take the grit up. And it's still going to last a long time, even when you take a bit of the grit off. And now it might be a little bit easier to sand the back. And once you get going, it becomes easier. So I'm just going in a circle and turning it every few times just to make sure I'm evenly sanding this down. And this is going to give me a nice smooth finish on the back. You don't have to do this part if you don't mind the back being a little bit uneven or messy looking, but I like the back to be nice and smooth. And you can see when you start sanding it, the little lighter colored areas are where the clay's a little bit uneven still. And then I'll just take my sanding sponge and kind of go at those little bits until they're gone. Now I'm going to drill a hole for the ear wires to go through. And the shape of this makes that pretty easy to decide where to put it. So I'm using the pin vise with a small twist drill. And I'm lining it up in the middle of this corner, and I like to just twist it a tiny bit and then brush it off and see that, make sure that the hole looks centered and that it's not too close to any edge. And you can make minor adjustments here before you go all the way through. And look again, and that looks pretty centered. So I'll go all the way through now. And I'm working on this cutting mat so that I don't damage the table or a tile or anything. So I'm moving slowly. I didn't try to poke it all the way through. I'm going to clean it off, and I'm going to, while holding it, I'm going to gently continue to drill while supporting it with my hand so that I don't suddenly pop through and collapse and break this. And once I've got all the way through, I'll kind of back out. And I need this hole to fit 20 gauge wire for the ear wire, so it's probably just right. I don't want the wire to be tight. I want the earring to hang freely and not to kind of get caught. But just in case, I'm going to take a round needle file and just enlarge it slightly on both sides. It's better if it's a little bit too big than too small. Okay, I'm happy with that. Also, I went in from the back so that the design doesn't mess with my eye. This way I can just perfectly center that hole. And then I'm going to use Cindy Pope's trick for beveling the edge of the hole, and using a 4 millimeter stone setting burr to just gently bevel the edge. This also helps things hang nicely. Just a few twists. These also cut really fast, so you got to be careful. And then lastly, I'm just going to take the corner off the top of this. The further the distance from this edge to the hole, the bigger the loop on the ear wire will have to be. So I just want to make sure I don't have to make a giant loop on the ear wire. And I'm just kind of blending that so it's not obvious. All right. And we're just going to make double sure that your piece is completely dry. And then this goes on an open shelf 2 hours at 1675. So when you're finished with all your sanding, you can use your tissue blade to gather up that dust. And I just like to pop it in the little container. And that'll accumulate over time and can be reclaimed or sent to the refinery. Just save all your dust, it will add up over time. For the next step, these are the tools you're going to need. Clay tack, a tile, the snake maker, the ultra clay pick or any kind of clay pick, palette knife, dry brush, a 5 millimeter mandrel, some tweezers, a micro brush in regular size, a plastic mallet, 600 grit sandpaper, a bench block, your cabochon and bezel cup, and some fun tack to pick the stone up, and your fired piece. Now I'm going to go ahead and make sure that my stone fits properly in the bezel. You always want to do a test fit before you actually attach it, because once it's attached, it's done. And I'm using the fun tack as a way to pick the stone up pretty easily. And what I'm looking for is that the stone isn't a tight fit, but it's also not loose and shaking around in there. We really want it to be the same size. So this doesn't move, and it went in pretty easily. So we've got a good match there. And that's generally the case when you use any kind of calibrated cabochons or stones. Then I want to make sure that this bezel cup is flat. Sometimes they're not entirely flat on the bottom. So I'm using this 5mm mandrel. I'm holding it perfectly flat against the bezel, and I'm going to give it a few taps. And this is really going to flatten out the bottom because it's fine silver, it's really soft. And it's also going to straighten out the bezel walls if they've become squished in any way. So now it should be perfectly flat on the bottom. All right, now I want to make sure that the fired piece is completely flat. Sometimes things can bow up a little bit in the kiln. Just to make sure, I'm going to make this completely flat. Few taps is all it takes. Next, I want to add some tooth to the bottom of this bezel and remove any residue that might have got on there by just gently using this 600 grit sandpaper. I don't want to move a lot of material, I just want to make sure it's flat. And that's going to stick to my finger probably. Nope. And then you can see when you sand it if you've missed any spots, if there's high or low spots, and there aren't. So that tells me that this is nice and flat, and it's also got a little bit of tooth now to help the paste stick. Now I'm going to make some paste with clay tack, and this will allow me to join two fired pieces together. Regular paste won't create enough of a bond between two metals. Just using a little bit of clay. I want this to be fairly thick. Definitely not a slip. All right, I think I need a little more. I'm just using this clay pick to get it out of the bottle. It's kind of got a jelly consistency, so it doesn't really pour. And this is going to make a really smooth, lovely paste once it's all mixed together. And then I'm going to take my micro brush and my piece. Actually, I'm going to take my bezel cup and hold it in my non-dominant hand. And I'm just going to take a tiny bit of this and put it right on this cup. You might be tempted to use more, but you really only need the tiniest bit. And I'm going to keep squeezing it and switch it back to my dominant hand. I'm going to place this, get it right in the middle where I have previously flattened the clay. And I'm just kind of tapping around, make sure it's really centered well. And I can use the tip of my tweezer, push it down a little more. And I'm going to use the kind of corners of this piece to help me visually verify that it's centered. I think this needs to move over a tiny bit. And then I'm going to take my snake roller and give it a final press. And I'm going to come in with this dry brush. These bristles are a little bit stiff. I'm just gonna very carefully wipe away some of the excess. And every time I use it, I'm wiping it off on my hand so that I don't just spread it around again. And I'm also trying not to move it. I'll give it one more check before letting it dry to make sure it's still centered. Now I'm going to let this dry completely, and I can come back with a wet brush if I want to clean up any more, but I think this will probably be perfect. And then this is going to go, once it's completely dry, back into the kiln for another 2 hours at 1675 open shelf. For our next step, we're going to need our bench block, a silicone point, the fun tack, the fired piece, of course, our cabochon, a jump ring, the 5mm mandrel, some fine point tweezers, the plastic mallet, a white glove, and 600 grit sandpaper. So the first thing we need to do is make sure that our bezel height is correct for the stone. And when I pop this in, I can see right away that this bezel is too high. And what I want is for the top of the bezel to be slightly above the girdle of the stone. So on this example stone, this is the top surface, and the side here is the girdle. And we want the bezel to just be very slightly above that girdle so that when we press it down, it captures it in securely. There are a couple of ways to deal with a bezel that's too high. One is to lift the stone. So I have here a jump ring that I have flattened a little bit with a hammer, and it fits just right in here, and that will lift the stone. When you lift with a material under the stone, you don't want it to wiggle around, so I made sure to make this jump ring the same size or slightly smaller than the bezel cup so that it doesn't move. And now I'll get my fun tack so I can pick this stone up more easily, sort of. And I'll have another look. And that's a lot closer. It's still a little bit too high. Now, most stones have a thicker girdle than these CZs. They have a really thin girdle, so they sit quite low. So you won't always have to raise the stone or sand the bezel down. Sometimes they fit just right. But usually you have to do a little bit of adjusting. This one we're going to do quite a bit. So I'm going to take this jump ring out, and I'm going to sand the bezel down a bit. Very gently, trying to keep it level. I don't want to push down one side or the other, or it's going to sand it unevenly. I'm just barely touching, going in a circle, and then turning it. Actually, this kind of infinity loop is a better practice for even sanding. And then I'm going to stop and test the fit again. Because it's easy to overdo it and you can't get it back once you've taken it off. A little bit more, and then we'll be good. And you'll just continue sanding and testing until your bezel is the perfect height, slightly above the girdle, half to 1 millimeter or so. So before I apply the patina, I'm going to give this one more tap with the mandrel just to make sure it's still sitting flat and that the walls haven't been pressed in at all by the last firing. And then next, I'm going to put my white glove on, and the reason that I'm doing this is because I need to clean this to prep it for patina, and I don't want to get any fingerprints on it. If you want to achieve a really nice, dark, consistent patina. It needs to be a very clean surface before you apply the patina. So I'm going to use this portable Fortum micromotor. A rotary tool is really the easiest way to clean the metal with a fiber wheel. This is a superfine fiber wheel, and it's my secret weapon for getting a nice polish and for also cleaning a piece to get a nice patina. So it's a fairly low speed I've got this on. Very important that you're wearing safety glasses and you have your hair tied back. And I'm holding the piece with the gloved hand. And I'm just not applying much pressure. I'm going to go around this. I'm holding the piece very tightly so it doesn't go flying. This Fortum micromotor is very quiet and handy. All right, so I'm happy with that. It's pretty clean. Turn this off. And then when you sand the bezel down, you're kind of removing some metal, and you often get like little sprues of silver that kind of hang around the edges of the bezel, and we want to clean those off because they'll become very visible when you set the stone and they don't look nice. So I've got this tiny little silicone bit in here. I believe this is the medium silicone bit. And I'm going to turn this Dremel back on, Fortum back on. Just real quickly, I'm going to go over the interior of this. And this is going to clean up that edge. And then I'm also going to go about a 45-degree angle and clean up around the outside, trying not to touch anything but the bezel. And this will get rid of those little sprues from sanding. It's also important to try to do this in a ventilated area with an extractor fan or outside. You don't want to breathe in the particles from these bits. All right, now we're ready to patina. All right, now I'm ready to add the patina. I've got 2 dishes with distilled water, and one has baking soda to neutralize the black marks. And I like to apply with a Q-tip, and I like to loosen it up a little bit, and then it absorbs a little bit more. And I'll just dip the Q-tip in, and then I'll just kind of dab it on. And I'm avoiding getting it inside the bezel cup. You don't really, especially with translucent stones, you don't want that patina getting in there because it's really hard to get it out. And you can also do the back if you'd like. Totally up to you. And I'm happy with how that is applied. It's nice and dark and even. So I'm going to neutralize the Q-tip too before throwing that out. And I'm just going to plop that in there to neutralize, and then use my plastic tweezers to grab it. All right. And then I'll give it a little swish in the plain water to rinse it. Take the glove off. I don't want to touch it with any patina that's left on the glove. And now we've got a nice dark patina. So I'm going to dry this. You don't want to dry this with heat. It can actually alter the patina. It can turn it strange colors, give it a white cast. So we're going to let this dry. You can put in a dehydrator on low heat or no heat for a while. Just make sure it's completely dry before you move on to the next step. All right, our piece is completely dry, so we're going to go ahead and start polishing this patina back to raise the high spots and give it some good contrast. Again, I like to use these mini fiber wheels in a super fine grit. They leave a really nice satin finish on their own. I prefer using rotary tools whenever possible to polish because it saves your hands, it's faster, and it can most of the time achieve a nicer finish than you could do with your hands. Not always, but most of the time. And there are a lot of options for rotary tools, from handheld Dremels to this portable Fordham to a full-size flex shaft, all different price ranges. I highly recommend using a rotary tool to save your hands and save some time. All right, I'm going to turn this on pretty low. And I'm going to start by removing it on the back side where I didn't actually want it, but when you work with patina, it's easy for it to get on your gloves and spread to the piece. You can see how quickly this fiber wheel removes the patina. I'm going to turn up a tiny bit. Again, wearing glasses, safety glasses, hair out of the way. All right, and then I'm going to go over to the sides here. Try to not catch this fiber wheel on the corners of things. It'll kind of loosen the fibers up and it won't last quite as long. That always happens eventually, but you try not to catch it on the corners. It'll last a little bit longer. All right, and now I'm going to move right to the top. And what's nice about these fiber wheels is that they don't get into the deep recesses very much. So they may remove a bit of the patina from the low spots, but it will also leave most of it. And a nice satin finish. I'm going to angle it a little so I can get into these, get up close to the bezel. And then I'm also going to turn it completely and just go around the bezel itself. And now I'm going to switch the bit here. And I'm going to put in a fine silicone tipped polishing bit. And I'm just going to go carefully over this top edge a couple of times. The fine doesn't really remove much material, it just gives it a polish and kind of evens it out. It leaves a lot of dust. Turn it. All right, we are ready to set the stone. We're going to use a bezel pusher and then an agate burnisher to set the stone. I'm working on this bench block just to raise it up a little. And I've got my fun tack with my stone on it. But first I'm going to put this jump ring back in. And I'll pop the stone on. And I'm going to hold it firmly on one side with my finger on top and take my bezel pusher and I'm going to push it in and over. Not too much pressure. You really don't want to miss or skid with this. It will possibly scratch the stone, possibly hurt your finger. So go slow and try not to hurt yourself. And I'm doing the four corners. So I did north to south and then east to west. And now I'm going to go in between and do the same thing again. And then I'm just going to look around and find all the bits that are still sticking out a little and squish them in. Fine silver is really soft, so it doesn't take much to close this. I've also rounded the end of this bezel pusher a little bit. It's very slight, but if you don't have sharp ends there, it'll keep the bezel from getting marred too much. And once that looks like it's all evenly pressed in, I'm going to go in with this agate burnisher. And this is going to really push that top edge down, give it a little shine, and make sure that stone is really secure. So I hold it pretty low down here, and I'm coming at, not quite perpendicular, but almost. And I'm just rubbing that top edge down. If you go at too much of an angle, you're just going to be hitting the stone. And the burnisher probably won't scratch it, but it's just better to stay off the stone as much as possible. That's looking good. The stone is now set, and it's captured by the bezel. When you set your stone, you often leave marks around it from the agate burnisher and the pusher. So I like to give it one more polish just to clean up and even out the finish. But when you're polishing, once the stone is set, you need to protect the stone because this fiber wheel will dull it up. So I'm using my thumb to hold it and keep it safe from the fiber wheel. Clean up the edge of that bezel a little bit. So this is the super fine silicone wheel again. And this won't hurt the stone as long as you don't focus too much on the stone, and keep it away from the stone as much as possible. And with a light touch, and again at about a 45-degree angle, I'm just going to go in and touch that edge. And this is really going to give it a clean and professional finish by smoothing out any little kinks or unsmooth edges. And lastly, I'm going to use a superfine sanding sponge, going in one direction across. Give it a final polish. This gives it a really nice subtle glow. You can do it along the back as well. I'm trying to keep it in one direction. And here are the earrings all finished with their ear wires attached. I hope you have fun experimenting with this technique and trying different stones and designs in your own work. Thanks for watching.